So welcome, everyone. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center. And welcome to the virtual reading group. As you all know, we've been reading for the last few months this new collection, Thinking Without a Banister, edited by Jerome Kohn. And it's a number of essays, some unpublished, some published, letters and other things, largely written, at least the essays we've read so far, including the one for today, in the early 1950s. The main essay we're talking about today is called Culture and Politics, and all it says about it in the list of texts at the beginning is that it was found in Hannah Arendt Papers, Manuscript Division, Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. Those of you who've been in this group for a while have read another essay that is quite similar to this, called Crisis in Politics, which is in her collection Between Past and Future, and seems to be, and I imagine is, a later revision and elaboration of, an extension of this essay, although there's an enormous amount of overlap between the two. And so for those of you who would like, I would recommend at some point after we finish today going back and rereading the Crisis in Culture, and you can also watch the introduction we did for that, and also revisit the discussion we had. This Crisis in Culture and this Culture and Politics are structured differently. This one is in 5 parts, whereas the Crisis in Culture really is structured in 2 parts. But they're close enough related that for both of them, the real question is the question of judgment and its relation to both culture and arts and politics. And so we need to try and make sense of this. In the essay in the book, which begins on page 160, the first section is really about society, and society as both mass society and good society, and how both mass society and good society threaten culture. So we begin, and this is an important point for us, with the idea that culture is threatened, and it's threatened by society. What is society? Well, good society, which Arendt says is the beginning of the threat to culture, is the society of, at first, the courts the princes and kings. They have their courts, and everyone's in society, and those folks in society are scared to death that if they don't say the right thing or dress the right way, they will lose their position of influence. Then there's society in the sense of the bourgeois cultural Philistine, who, again, wants to appear important and have influence and power, and they collect art, and they collect artists as their patrons, and they imagine themselves as important and cultured as a way of increasing their value. And so culture becomes a commodity that people can buy in order to have power or standing in society. And then there's a third kind of society, which she calls mass society, which simply takes what's already been happening in good society and in the cultural Philistine society and expands it to everybody. Um, and yet, and so on the one hand, for Arendt, the problem is not mass society, it's society, because even in the cultural Philistine world, um, the culture, which is something that we're supposed to appreciate for itself and its lastingness, the artwork, has become useful and thus of value, and it can be devalued. The ausverkaufte Werte, the bargain sale of values. Once you start simply seeing a painting as something that covers a hole in the wall or makes you more important, you've devalued that culture. And so it's already been devalued. But at least in such a world, there are places you can escape from society. You can become a hermit. You can, you know, live in a small group of outsiders who loves art and keeps the traditions of poetry and storytelling and art loving alive. But in a mass culture, she says, a whole new phenomena emerges, and in that mass culture, there's nowhere to hide, A. And B, we must contend with the hydra of the entertainment industry. And the entertainment industry is dangerous, not because it makes books widely available or poetry widely available or because it puts things on TV. No, I mean, if you put a production of Antigone on TV, she says that could still, for some people, not be simply a Philistine idea, but actually would be about engaging Sophocles. But what the entertainment society does, the entertainment industry does, is it begins to change the cultural objects and projects and make them more accessible, because its goal is not to actually preserve culture but to entertain. And to the extent that the cultural ideas, the artworks are not exciting enough, we change them. We make them more understandable. We shorten, we abridge, we make them brighter, we repaint them, all sorts of things, to make them more exciting for the mass consumer. And she says, Antigone can survive being forgotten, and Antigone can survive being produced in cheap editions. But once you create new editions of Antigone where the hard parts are taken out and it's made accessible, then Antigone can't survive. And then culture begins to really be lost in a way that is irretrievable, because there is no, the whole premise of culture is that you care for a world that exists and that lasts. And that world is now deeply threatened. And thus, the cultural products are torn out of the world in which they are preserved and brought into the realm of life, the life process of society, bread and circus. And they become part of what keeps us alive and happy. And pleasure is part of life, but everything is brought within the idea of pleasure, and the gravitas of the world begins to disappear. So that's the sort of core of section 1 of her essay. Section 2 is about the conflict between politics and culture and which standards should reign. Culture says that the standard is that the product is useful. We produce it, it should have a use. And if we're at the height of culture, it should at least have the use of being beautiful and making us, striking us in its beauty. Politics has a different standard. It's not the standard of the mastery of producing something as a means for an end, but it is the standard of what unites people, what holds them together. We act together and we form a bond with each other. And then for section 3, she says that there are 2 ways that we can create such a bond. The artist takes thinking and objectifies it through objectivization in an object which we can see, and that object stands for what unites us, for what is common. And insofar as we as a people recognize the beauty of that object and talk about it, it becomes a common world around which we gather. And so the judgment of the beautiful in the artwork unites us around the artwork. The other way that we can unite is not through an artwork that is objectified, but through the creation of a polis, a political space. And their thinking is not objectified in an artwork. Thinking is objectified, she says, through the ceaseless narrative of commemoration. This is, it's Memorial Day weekend here in the United States. Some of us are here in the United States. We are commemorating, the armed forces, the sacrifice of people who fought for this country, and we tell that story. Of course, many people forget that and think it's a place for barbecuing and baseball, but that's okay. The point is we tell common narratives. We are a polis, and in so doing, we take the thoughtful core of the country and we make it objective in the ceaseless commemoration. She's worried, as you, I'm sure, have picked up in reading the essay, that more and more the victory of culture over politics, the victory of the production idea of the artist over the political, has led to the barbarization of politics, such that politics is seen only as a means-end activity and not as this relational activity of being in a polis. The final section is the key section of the essay. It's also the key. It's also very much related to the last section of her essay, Crisis and Culture. And in it, she argues that culture and politics are, while they have differences, are united by something that is deeply important. And what they're united by is that they're both public. And insofar as they're public, in both culture and in politics, decisions and judgments have to be made. And in the making of decisions and judgments, we decide who we are, and we decide what we share, and we decide how we're going to live. And thus, we need this kind of public unification that comes through judgment that is at the root of both culture and politics. And this brings us back to the very beginning of this essay, Culture and Politics, because the argument at the beginning is that culture is threatened, right? It is threatened by the rise of society. The rise of society is the rise of a group of lonely, abandoned people with one opinion who act in conformity. And in such a world, there is no way to reassert judgment, namely what unites us. If we don't engage in the cultural and political judgments of deciding what we share, and we either break into little parts, I believe this, you believe that, and we don't care, we don't try and convince each other, well, then we lose the ability to have a political world, and we lose the ability to have a cultural world. And if we're unable to come to some agreement, and we think it's all just subjective, again, we lose the ability to have a common world. And if we assume, of course, everyone agrees, and anyone who doesn't agree is simply evil, because we live in a society, and a society all shares one opinion because it's good society or mass society, then again, we lose the discerning judgment, and we of both cultural and political judgment, and we are subjected to simply the one judgment of society, which is at this point an untutored judgment, because we're not practiced in making judgments through culture or politics anymore, and is one that is usually driven by mass movements or economic utility and entertainment. So that's the sort of scope of the essay, which is that we're in a crisis of judgment and a crisis of culture. They go together. And that crisis of culture has two elements. One, it threatens artistic culture, or the culture of aesthetics. And secondly, it threatens politics, which is also an activity of judgment. I will stop there, except to say, to point out one quote, which is one of my favorite passages or quotes in all of Arendt's writing. It's in both essays, this one and The Crisis in Culture. And in this essay, it's on the last page, 184. And she compares two ancient Roman sayings. The first one that she says is Platonic in both its content and meaning. Amicus Socrates, amicus Plato sed magis, estimanda veritas. Amicus Socrates, I love Socrates. Amicus Plato, I love Plato. But I hold truth in even higher esteem. And so this is for her the argument of the philosopher, and also the artist. I mean the maker, and also the social scientist, we should say today. It's someone who thinks that truth is more important than love or friendship. And she contrasts it with a statement attributed to Cicero, errare malo cum Platone quam cum istus Pythagoreus vera sentire. I would rather be in error with Plato than experience the truth with the Pythagoreans. And here, her understanding of it is that in an important way, my taste for Plato and the beauty of Plato is more important than the truth. And even if Plato happened to be in error, I would rather live and maybe die in error with Plato and my friends than know the truth. And she takes this to be the essence of humanism. That humanism here, in an important way and an important understanding for Arendt, is to live in a humanly built world. This is very much what separates us from other animals for her. It's not our reason, it's not truth. It's to live in a world that is humanly built and in some way, therefore, lasts longer than our mortal being. To be human is to live an immortal life, which we as human can't live biologically or individually. We can only live by creating a world, a common world. And that world is created by judgments, cultural judgments and political judgments. And the essence of humanism for Arendt is that we, in some important sense, must love the world more than truth, and even more than our own lives. And I'm going to add one other thing then, because it is a nice editorial touch. Jerry Kohn on page 163 offers a helpful footnote, I think, where he is talking about the sentence that it comes after is, culture relates to objects and is a phenomenon of the world, and pleasure relates to people and is a phenomenon of life. We could add that not only culture relates to objects and is a phenomenon of the world, we could say politics relates to the polis and to the people gathered in the polis. and is a phenomena of the world. Both culture and politics are thus opposed by Arendt to life. And Jerry offers this footnote. She says people have criticized Arendt for being hostile to life. And Arendt responds in a passage quoted by Susanna Young Gottlieb, quote, "I have opposed the world to life because we live in a time in which there has been and still is an enormous overestimation of life. An overestimation of life. We would rather continue to live. We would rather have pleasure and bread and circus, than preserve the world. An overestimation of life." And she continues, "I do not think that I am hostile to life. Life is a magnificent thing, but it is not the highest good." Now, I think what we have to say is human life is not the highest good for humans. For other species, life might be the highest good. But for her, humans are particularly those beings who can live in a world and thus create an immortal world and is thus more important than life. And she continues, "Whenever life is considered the highest good, it is as soon whisked away." So if we actually focus primarily on life, we will, in the end, destroy ourselves, because we will destroy the world that makes life worth living, and thus erode the conditions for life. She finally continues, "In our society there is a dangerous estrangement from the world, and alongside this, a terrible inability of human beings to love the world." So here we see the centrality of the idea of amor mundi, which, as you know, is one of the core ideas of her thought. To love the world more than life is to understand that for humans to live a human life, we must care for the world. And these essay on culture and politics is about the two aspects of that care. And that's what we should remember. Culture is from the Latin colere, meaning to care for, to husband, and it's the caring for the world. And the two ways we care for that common world are through culture and judgments of beauty, and politics, which are judgments of friendship, who we want to hang out with, what people we want to be with. And the crisis in culture, the danger in the loss of culture, is that both the cultural and political substantiality of the world will be threatened and will be lost. Okay, there's an attempt to sort of bring some parts of this essay into some sense. I'm going to go through some of the questions that I see already up here, and I'm happy to have people jump in. Bob asks, did Arendt successfully thread the needle between the claimed Greek antagonism between culture and politics, production and action, by pulling consensus communis out of a hat? Or have too many years passed between Socrates and Kant for this to hold? Okay, it's a good question. So let's make sure we all understand the Greek antagonism between culture and politics. Some of you, I'm sure, have read Plato. You know Plato's, fear of the artist, and the way Arendt reconstructs this is that the artist is somebody who does violence to the world. She doesn't talk about it so much in this particular essay. She says it, I think, a little bit better in in the crisis in culture. So I'm gonna refer to that. For her, she says culture is from colere, to cultivate, to dwell, to take care, to tend, or to preserve. And the Romans have the word culture. The Greeks didn't have the word culture. And she says this is related to why the Romans really weren't great artists and the Greeks were. She says there's no great Roman art. We can debate that, but she says it. She says what the Romans do is they cultivate Greek art. And the Greeks could be great artists, she says, because they were violent, because they tore art from the womb of the earth. The Greeks and Romans together, she says, together provide our understanding of culture in two senses. The Greek sense as culture as tearing nature and tearing up rock and making sculpture, tearing up the language and making poetry. That's one part of culture, the violent part. And then the Roman part is the care for the monuments of the past that holds on to that culture and makes it a world in which we can live. So if we understand culture in this sense of both violent tearing and a kind of dwelling, it is opposed to politics in a few ways. In one sense, it's opposed to politics because for the Greeks, and here for Arendt, politics is supposed to be nonviolent. It's supposed to be about persuasion. It's supposed to be about talking and acting in ways that we come together. And insofar as the model for cultural production is violent and using means for an end and accomplishing some end, and any end can justify the means, it is deeply opposed to politics. It's also opposed to politics insofar as it's deeply connected to memorializing the past, which is one thing politics does, but another thing politics does is change things and move towards the future. And so there's this antagonism she sees between culture and politics. There's also things that hold culture and politics together, she argues. That's what sections 4 and 5 of this essay are about. And the common element that she thinks connects culture and politics is A, that they're both phenomena of the public world, and B, that they are both objectifications of thinking, and thus manifestations of judgment in the public sphere, not my personal judgment, but of a common judgment. So what I'm trying to do here is answer Bob's question by saying she's not trying to thread the needle between culture and politics. She's trying to say that there's a way in which culture and politics have been separated in the tradition by seeing politics and culture largely under the influence of the idea of cultural production and mastery and means ends activity, and thus violent activity. And insofar as the tradition has focused on that aspect of culture and politics, it has overlooked another aspect of culture and politics, which is what holds them together, not what separates them, which is A, that they're both concerned with the public sphere, and that they are concerned with the public sphere in a way that creates judgments that unite, either cultural judgments that unite around ideas of beauty, or political judgments that unite around common ways of living our lives. And what she argues is that Kant is the first and greatest thinker to have understood the deep interconnection between cultural judgment, judgments of taste, and political judgment, such that a political judgment is a claim, just like a cultural judgment, which when we say Van Gogh's paintings of the shoes, the peasant shoes, are beautiful, we don't say I think, we say they are beautiful, and we claim that others must or should agree with us. Now, we can't compel them. Well, we could, but we don't. We attempt to show them in a way and persuade them. And there's no way to prove it, but it is a judgment that we say is a communal judgment, and that's what a judgment of taste is. And a political judgment is a judgment to say, democracy is good. Again, there's no proof for this. There's no logic to it. It's not a true judgment, but it's a judgment that we try and make, and we woo other people to it, as she writes on page 182 in this text. So that the judgment of taste, she says, is also like a political judgment in that it carries no obligations. There's no cognitive obligation. It cannot prove anything. All the judging person can do, as Kant nicely puts it, is to woo everyone's agreement. And this wooing, which happens when I say Van Gogh's shoes are beautiful and when I say democracy is an unmitigated good, or the rule of law is an unmitigated good, as John Langbein famously put it, is something that we hope to woo people to. And so I guess, Bob, that's what I'm trying to say is I don't think she's trying to thread a needle. I think she's trying to say is there was a traditional way in which these two ideas have been separated, culture and politics, but actually there's a way in which they have a lot in common, and Kant was the first thinker or philosopher to see what they had in common and begin to think about it as a political philosophy. Do you want to chime in, Bob, or anyone on that?
Well, that's a lot to digest, and you've very eloquently gone through quite a number of issues. I have a few questions, confusions in my mind. One of them is this matter of violence as somehow characteristic of art or of culture. Anything we do is violent, as human beings when we eat. If we eat animals, if we eat vegetables, we go outside and we pollute, or I'm a gardener, we tear up the soil, maybe kill some worms. So I don't see exactly how culture, in the limited sense of artistic culture, is any different from anything else we do, from the practical life, from business, from, I don't know, interpersonal relations, maybe not. So there's that confusion. The other is her definition of art as beauty. And I probably subscribe to that, except the history of art, let's say in the 21st century, is not so much beauty as it is pushing the concept forward. There are quite a few artists, especially, this is my taste, abstract expressionists, that I think are ugly. I think de Kooning's ugly. People may take exception to that. I think other artists are, they're not beautiful, they're not ugly. Certainly she knew Albers and de Kooning. I mean, they must have traveled in the same circles. And, Albers is curious. Rothko, is another one who's curious to me. rather than, well, maybe Rothko had some beauty there, but certainly not de Kooning and maybe others. So, it seems to me that her concept of art or of culture is possibly dated or possibly limited. Just two separate strains of thought.
Thank you. Those are two excellent strains of thought. Let me see if I can say something about both of them. On the question of violence, what she has in mind here are two different ways of um, of 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 uh, of making judgments and acting in the world. One is based on a model of production, where I, as the master artist or producer, take a stone and carve it up and make a sculpture. Or I, as the poet, take the language and turn it into something that does what I want it to do. The scientist also thinks this way, as does, well, I mean, we can, at least in one idea of science and in one idea of the businessman, you raised, which is, I am the businessman, I create a business to do what I want it to do, and I rule all the people, and they will follow my rule, and we will produce the widgets that I want to produce. And you can imagine politics in this form. I am the king, or I am the premier, and I set the agenda, and I have ministers, and they do as I say. And so what she's suggesting is that the very idea of political sovereignty that is so widely taken as common sense in Western political thought and in much of Western politics, is rooted not in an ancient political way of thinking, but in an ancient way of thinking that comes out of cultural production, of the master craftsman who controls everything as a sovereign. And her claim is that there is another way in which another tradition of politics, and we might even say another tradition of business, right, where collectives as opposed to top-down Fordist models of production, and so and in politics as well, there's a model of politics that doesn't imagine a king or a premier setting the agenda, but people together collectively acting together to do so. And so what she's trying to say is that we need to, in order to understand, in order to think about culture and politics and the crisis of them and their relation, we have to understand that in a profound way, for the Greeks and the Romans, culture as a means of sovereign production was opposed to politics as a means of relational activity together. And that we have forgotten that aspect of the difference because we've now assumed that everything is understood in this sort of cultural production way. So that's what I take to be her point. And she wants to open up new possibilities for politics today by recapturing an older idea of politics, not governed by the cultural production model. In fact, one, she argues, that originally was opposed to the cultural production model, and we've forgotten that the core of that opposition. On the question of the beautiful and of art, I mean, yeah, this is very, on one level, very controversial within the art world. But I do want to say that by beauty, she doesn't mean subjective beauty. And she doesn't even mean, I mean, you say de Kooning is ugly, right? Maybe. But that doesn't mean it's not beautiful in the sense, I think, in which she's talking about it. I believe the idea of beauty she has in mind is a classical idea of beauty that she takes out of both Nietzsche and Heidegger, which is that beauty is what shines forth, erscheinen. And for her, the beautiful is what strikes us, what shines in such a way that we are struck by it and captivated by it. And thus the ugly can captivate us as well as the pleasing. Beauty is not the same as pleasing, is I think what I want to say. What captivates us is when we see something that is shocking, new, thought-provoking. When a work of art objectifies a thinking, that's what she thinks works of art do, is objectify thinking. She says an artist thinks and then puts that thinking, reifies it, which means thingifies it into a thing. And when that thing strikes us, it shines like the sun, and we are struck by it, and we start talking about it. And that's when we are called to make a judgment. Is it beautiful or not? We can then call it ugly or beautiful. But it's not based on whether it's pleasing. It's based on whether it makes, whether the thought within it is right in some way, not in the sense of true or objectively true, but is one that we see as meaningful. And that's how I understand her approach to beauty and art. The artist is the one who thinks in private, and she talks a little bit about this in this essay. I forget where she talks about it, but the artist can only work in private because the artist must, it's on page 179, because the artist must separate themselves from the social. The social is the realm of society where we come with common opinions. Well, if you are an artist and you live in the society and you live in public, the chance of you coming up with an idea that is new, that you could thingify in a way that would really strike people as different and worth thinking about, is very small. That's why one of the reasons Arendt is such an interesting thinker of privacy and private life is she believes that in order for artists to exist, there need to be private spaces where they can be unique and different and outside the homogenization of the societal sphere. What they create, the artwork, is public. And that's the relation between culture and politics. It's the artworks and the political actions which are related publicly, but not the artist. So I don't know. I hope that helps in some way.
I think it helps a lot. The erscheinen, or what captures our attention, would save somebody like Duchamp, who put the urinal in the 1913 show, and of course the artistic value there isn't the object itself, but it's the idea of the object and the context of that in the history of art. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and by the way, this is a bit of biography, and some people may exclude it for those reasons. But the artwork that Arendt had in her apartment in New York was largely done by some of her German emigre friends and was largely abstract. A man named Heidenreich was one of the few artists, modern artists, that she knew. who before the war had been a figurative painter, but after the war felt like many other painters that you could not paint figuratively and capture the world as it was, and began to paint very abstractly. And so this is just a personal anecdote to say that, as far as I understand Arendt, the beauty of the work of art is not in its pleasantness per se, but in the thinking behind it. And I think that's very much her understanding of art. Daphne writes that she has been involved in a seminar on Odysseus for the past 10 months. And this essay is truly mind-opening, so much to think about. Okay, do you have a question, Daphne, or a comment, or just that?
No, I'm sad that I hadn't read this article before I started the seminar, because we were working from the Homeric, and then we went to Virgil, and the contrast between the Greek and the Roman was something that I sorely lacked. I realize now that I've read her article. But I did have a question about your summary earlier of the second section. I'm not sure I understand. In the second section, you said that culture is useful because that Arendt thinks it's useful because it produces beauty, or did I misunderstand what you were saying? I'm sorry, it may not be relevant to the discussion at this point.
Well, no, so there's a couple of different ways that we have come to distrust culture, right? One is the Philistines' distrust of culture, in which it's simply a value. Then there's the mass culture. And then she says there's an older distrust of culture in Greek and Rome, which is rooted in politics. And the political distrust of culture is one in which culture is seen as a means-ends activity for the production of things. Now, that includes houses and tools and books, but it also includes art. And what culture does is it creates public things that last and creates a world, a humanly created world. And it does so on a means-ends continuum. When you create a house, it's to live in or something. But it's never fully means-ends. You also want the house to be more than that, beautiful or appealing in some way. And so it always exceeds that a bit. If you think of culture as building a world that lasts, the cultural activity that most builds things that last is the activity of art, because art builds things that aren't useful in themselves, but are there to to embody ideas, thoughts, and that become last. They're not consumed. They're not, and they don't. And we preserve them in museums and other things, and thus they last the longest. So artworks, on the one hand, come out of the cultural activity of producing things, which is useful, but they themselves, if they are pure art, are supposed to be useless, and therefore never consumed and thus lasting. So that's how she understands art in the end, on that idea. Okay. She talks a lot about this. If you're interested in the last chapter of the work section of the Human Condition, you can read more about it then. Is someone trying to say something?
Yes, Roger, it's Kevin.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question about that last section having to do with Kant's discussion of judgment and his relationship of it to taste. I found that very interesting. I've actually got sort of two questions about that I think are related. So I'll just ask both of them and then let you respond, or others if they have responses. So I know she wrote more in her last book about judgment, was not able to finish that section. I haven't read that yet. I'm just wondering sort of how this, whether her discussion there echoes some of this, whether there's similarities or differences. That's the first question. And then I'm also, assuming that taste is somewhat similar to aesthetics. I know there's been, since she wrote, a lot of effort to relate aesthetics and politics, also to relate aesthetics and ethics in various writers. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on how her work kind of fits in that context.
Say that last part again, Kevin. Her work relates.
Cut out.
Her work relates what and what?
Well, there's been a lot of work done by various people on the relationship between aesthetics and politics, or aesthetics and ethics, providing a kind of grounding for ethics. And I'm just wondering, whether you have any thoughts about how that issue has sort of developed since she wrote, and how her writing on it might sort of connect up with that.
Yeah, I mean, of course. Okay, of course. So on the first question, the question of judgment in Arendt's thought generally is one of the growth industries, we might say, to speak crudely, in Arendt's studies, and the fact that she never actually started the last section of The Life of the Mind, which was to be on judgment. She died with the title page and epigraph in the computer, in the typewriter, and never got past that. So that, of course, has led innumerable scholars to attempt to reconstruct what she would have said if she had written that last section on judgment. And some of these attempts are really amazing and some less so. But the main texts would be actually this little essay here that you just read, and the essay, The Crisis in Culture, which is sort of I believe, the second draft of this. There's a number of other texts. The thinking section, at the end of the thinking section of Life in the Mind, she has a section on what judgment would mean. Some of the essays in the book Responsibility and Judgment, especially thinking and moral considerations, are important. Her essay, there's a number of different essays in which she writes that are important in our attempt to reconstruct what she would have meant by judgment. There's also a little book that's been published of her lectures that she gave on Kant's political philosophy and his idea of judgment, that was published by Ronald Biner. And that is one of the most important sources for thinking about this idea of judgment. Some of you, I know, have read some of the stuff I've written recently on her idea of reconciliation, and I've made the argument that her thinking about reconciliation is at the actual center of her understanding of judgment. So there's a lot out there on this, and it is a very important and fertile field in which to continue thinking. Having said that, you asked for some of my thoughts on this, so I'll give you some of them. And it's this: as we have said innumerable times in our discussions, for Arendt, in politics, there is no truth. There's opinions. But that doesn't mean that all opinions are equal. Now, all opinions are equal in the sense that they are opinions, and they have a right to be heard, and they're part of the plurality of the world. But she thinks there are better opinions and worse opinions. And just like there are better artworks and worse artworks. And so the great innovation of her thinking about judgment and her use of Kant is to say that Kant's political philosophy is found in his aesthetic philosophy. And that's a controversial claim. Not everyone agrees with it, but it's one that she made, and it's an extraordinarily original and important claim. And as I understand it, most simply, it is this: that when an artist like pick one that you have in mind recently, Daniel Libeskind's museum, Holocaust Museum in Berlin, or if you have an artwork that you find incredibly compelling. We could talk about This Is America, Childish Gambino video, which just appeared. When an artwork appears, and it is a work that in some way is original enough and new enough to strike us, it shines in this way that Bob and I were talking about a minute ago, we pay attention. In all honesty, I don't mean to be a jerk, but 99.9% of the artworks we don't pay attention to. And one of the problems we have today in our culture, let me rephrase that. One of the challenges we have in our culture today is that some people pay attention to some artworks and other people pay attention to other artworks. And there's very few, and we might even say no artworks that compel all of our attention. The art world, like the literary world, like the philosophy world, like the political world, has been sectionalized, divided up. But from Arendt's point of view, what art does is an artist who thinks deeply in private and has an idea, objectifies it, thingifies it, puts it out there. And if it's new, people will look at it, and if they find it compelling, they will gather around it and start talking about it. And the idea that is in the artwork and that they're able to talk out of the artwork becomes a common story that becomes part of the public world that we share. So that the spectators are part of the artistic process, right? This is an essential idea of her understanding of art. It's not just the artist. The artist thingifies it and makes it. But once the artist makes it, the artist has no more control over it. It's the spectators, it's us, who gather around, talk about it, tell stories about it. Well, in the same way, when a political actor does something, Martin Luther King gives certain speeches, I Have a Dream speech, or writes the letter from Birmingham jail. We talk about it because it strikes us and it compels us to say, what's the idea here? And we begin to think about it. And if that idea is compelling, we keep talking about it and we tell stories about it and we commemorate it in this constant commemoration, and it becomes part of our political world. But again, just like you needed the artist to create the video or the museum, you need the political actor to create the action. But in both cases, it's the spectators who then take control and tell the stories. And here's what I understand to be Arendt's aesthetic understanding of politics. Kevin, can you just mute your computer so we don't? The aesthetic understanding of politics is that politics is about a people as a group of spectators coming together in a public and talking about actions, doings, that people do and deciding which ones are meaningful enough that we will turn them into public stories and narratives that will come to define our public world and change our public world. And that's what I understand a big part of politics to be for Arendt. And that's the relation between culture, and you do that with artworks, and you do that with political action. And that's the aesthetic understanding of politics. So Kevin, if you can turn your mic on again if you want to follow up at all, but that's the basic idea of aesthetics.
No, that's great. The only thing I was going to say was when you talk about the role of the political actor being sort of analogous to the artist, I just thought that the artist creates a work of art. It seems to me that in a sense what the political actor creates is to use a kind of term that's very au courant these days, is the event, right? The event that we then react to and discuss. And I think she uses that term event in that first shorter preface to the Origins that we read. But that's all. Yeah, that was great.
No, you're absolutely right. She does. She's very, she doesn't make the event into a jargon, but she's interested in the experience. Words and deeds, she says, insert themselves into the public world. Now, most words and deeds insert themselves in the public world and are completely forgotten and ignored, right? How many of your and my words and deeds are going to be remembered? Very little, if any. To be a little bit more upbeat, hopefully my kids will remember some of them and they'll tell them to their kids, at least for a couple generations. And maybe some of my students will remember some of them and tell them to their students or their, okay, but very few of us are going to be immortal in the sense that Achilles was immortal, in the sense that people are telling the story of Achilles over almost 3,000 years after he went back into battle to avenge Patroclus. There's just a difference. And so there's very few people whose words and deeds or artworks will be remembered in an immortal way.
I have a question.
Yeah.
About that. When Hitler used Leni Riefenstahl to create some of those movies, they became art. So that's politics using art. That art still lasts. What would Hannah Arendt have said about, or did she say anything about that particular nexus of the political theater?
Well, she says that in the political world, morality is not a standard. And that the only standard for politics is greatness. Does it get itself remembered? Now, that doesn't mean at all that we should prefer Hitler to, Willy Brandt or something like that. It means that in politics, you act in a way that you put your words and deeds out, and either they will strike people and be remembered or not. Hitler's certainly did. But, and here's, I think, an important but, they were, in the end, rejected by the world. They lasted for a certain amount of time. Hitler had a run, as you might say. But in the end, the world very emphatically rejected Hitler's ideas. And so, Leni Riefenstahl, she made her art political, but she also made art that was, and is still by many people, considered meaningful art. But not, I think, in its political manifestation so much as in its formalistic manifestations. I don't know. I'd have to think a little bit more about particular movies of hers. But yes, I mean, there are, from Arendt's point of view, culture is not a moral endeavor. Politics is not judged, political greatness is not judged morally. But that doesn't mean that morality is unimportant to politics, because you still have to make judgments of actions, even if they're great acts. Great acts doesn't mean it's one that you might find that you judge positively. You might find it to be monstrous. And that is clearly how she judged Hitler at the time, right? I mean, she saw it very early. I mean, I think, I think you're seeing this across the political spectrum today. There's a lot of people who basically say about someone like Trump or Erdogan or Putin, look, there's a lot of things they say that are right. There's obviously they're obviously great political actors in the way they're able to compel people, and they're saying some things that are true, but they are monsters. They are not good people. And that's a question of judgment. And part of the danger that she's pointing to in this essay is when we lose culture and lose culture and politics as activities of judgment and turn them into simply cultures of production. The habit and the practice of making those kind of judgments is atrophied, and that's what I think we're seeing today. People are basically saying, well, Trump does what other people do. He manipulates the media, he lies. Yeah, but other politicians lie. The New York Times lies. Everyone lies. So what's the difference? Right? And there's a truth to that. And yet you have to be able to make a judgment that this is just despicable and monstrous. But very few people are comfortable making those kind of judgments. And they don't want to make that judgment. They want to ground it in fact, and they want to prove that Trump is different than other politicians who lie. Well, that's and one of the problems that we're having in that debate is that when you say that, the other side points to liberals who lie and Democrats who lie and newspapers who lie, and then they feel like they've equalized the playing field. And if you end up simply trying to figure this out on proof, you're going to not get anywhere. At some point, you have to be willing to make judgments. And the claim of this essay is that we're out of practice in making judgments, both cultural and, and you see it in culture. There's a lot of art out there, and a lot of, we had a lecture at Bard earlier this semester by David Bromwich, a wonderful professor at Yale who's spoken at the Arendt Center a number of times. And, the lecture was called, I think it was like against bad art or something along those lines. But the argument was we have to be willing to say this is bad art. And, that's something that very few people are comfortable with saying today. Because who's to say? Who's the judge? And what Bromwich was saying is we have to make those judgments. And if we get out of practice in making those judgments, we lose the ability to build a common world. And that's what I think. And the loss of that ability is what leads to things like flooding the world with bad art, but also flooding the world with bad politics. I have a second question from Bob, which says, might Arendt's position be more the consequence of our understanding of labor, work, and action, a forced correspondence, than it is of anything in the real world? Do any of us see a conflict between culture and politics? Should the federal, state, or municipal government foster art of any sort if it is a matter of non-legislative? Well, I mean, I think I tried to talk about the conflict between culture and politics earlier. There's two levels of it. One is the modern way we see it, and the other is and that's between, I'm a cultured, effete intellectual who collects art. I don't do politics, right? That's sort of like the modern conflict between culture and politics. And then the old one is that culture is a kind of violent, means ends activity, and politics is this activity of the polis. It is related to her labor, work, action debate, and she's developing labor, work, and action, and thinking about the human condition at the same time she's writing this essay. And clearly, in this essay, she's associating a certain understanding of culture and the predominance of culture over politics with the predominance of life over world, and thus life over both the work and action, which celebrate the public world. So yes, I mean, they are deeply related. Jennifer asks or writes, I focused on the footnote when I was reading the essay, quote, in our society, there's a dangerous estrangement from the world, and alongside that, a terrible inability by human beings to love the world. Right? We read that earlier. I saw it fairly literally. We love our culture so much that we're destroying our world, nature. Is this too literal? We love our culture so much that we're destroying our world, nature. Yeah, I think that is a little too literal for Arendt. You're right. We love our culture so much, but by culture in that sense, okay, what does it mean to love the culture? Well, there's three ways she talks about it. There's the what does she call it? The Philistine, the educated Philistine, who loves culture so much he buys it and sells it and turns it into a value that gives him credibility or status, and thus in doing so he destroys it, or she destroys it. So that's one way we do that. Then there's mass culture and the entertainment industry, which loves culture so much it makes it easier and easier and more accessible, and in so doing destroys it. And that's another way we destroy it. And then another older way is that we love culture so much that we turn all of life into our ability to make things. We make politics better through mastery. We make business better through it. And we assert a kind of hubristic mastery over the world. In all of these cases, what we do is we destroy the lasting cultural objects and man-made world, not the natural world, the man-made world that is the great achievement of humanity and makes us immortal. And so I don't think it's that we are destroying nature. I think it's that we're destroying the man-made world. Now, insofar as in our hubristic cultural love affair with our ability to destroy the world, we also consume the environment. We could end up destroying not only the world but the earth as well. And I think you could certainly extend this argument to that, but I think that's not the core of her argument there. John writes, I do not see that Arendt and ever saw or took on board the crisis in the sustaining of earthly life is the endurance of the biosphere. That is, the endurance of the biosphere. So this is a similar question to Jennifer's that we just had. She seems to assume that one way or another the evolution of life will continue. Do we not now need to add this and affirm that our care for the uniquely human world must entail care for the life of the planet, now a double purpose? So, I mean, it's a great question, and so let me answer that, and Jennifer's again, maybe take another stab at it. Some of you know I've written a lot about the prologue to the human condition, in which Arendt writes that the earth is the quintessence of the human condition. And I actually have a new essay which will be coming out in Philosophy Today in a couple of months, which really actually is exactly about this question. But what Arendt says is that humans are both earthly and worldly, right? We are earthly insofar as we live on this earth, and as living on this earth, we are not in control of it, and we are subject to fate and fortune and misfortune, and we're not in control of our lives. And yet we can also remake the earth and turn it into something we can control. We can get rid of oceans and replace them with mountains, and we can, make new oceans and make new lakes, and we do these things. We can redirect rivers, and so what she says is the great threat of the modern age and science is that we are becoming so adept at remaking the earth into a world that we actually are not only in danger of destroying the earth, we're actually in danger of destroying our earthliness, namely the idea that we are subject to fortune, fate, and not in control of our destiny. And she says, there's nothing in human nature that says we need to be earthly. We could turn ourselves into robots. We could turn ourselves into artificial beings through genetic manipulation and cloning and merging of ourselves with technology, like some of the futurists like Ray Kurzweil say. And we would still be human in some sense, but we would increasingly never be subject to fate. And she says in that prologue, we could leave the earth and live on spaceships. Actually, she says this at the end of the essay, end of the book. We could leave the earth and live on a spaceship in which everything in the spaceship was artificial, including all of the humans, which were made through test tubes and genetic manipulation. And we'd still be human in some sense, and yet in a completely different sense than humanity has existed for since the beginning. And that's what she means by the threat to the human condition, not to human nature. And so the question I think she raises is the earth and our earthliness worth saving? And she doesn't think that's a question that has a necessary answer. I think she fundamentally believes it is. But she doesn't think that there's a truth to it. She thinks it's a choice we have to make. It's a judgment. And we have to put that judgment before ourselves and make that judgment. And so, yes, I think she's writing about that in the 1950s and raising the question of whether saving the planet and living on this planet is essential to the human condition or not. And she says it's essential to the human condition as the human condition has emerged on this planet. But she says it's perfectly reasonable to think that we could leave this planet and live on artificial planets, as she writes, or in artificial spaceships, and still be human. and we have to decide if that's something we want to do. I take that to be the question she raises in the human condition.
Roger?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was my initial introduction to Arendt in the 60s, that beginning of the human condition, which blew many of me and my colleagues away. My question, however, is that I do not see in her subsequent work that she makes the requirement of judgment for the human condition, given its definition, as you just did, as an earthly condition, and its requirements were continuing, a major focus of her work. And if we took that on, which certainly contemporary circumstances, it seems to me, require us to do, judgments about the public world in the largest sense are not at the focus of either politics or culture, except in quite inadequate ways. So that there is, it seems to me, a great deal of constructive work, probably in the sphere of judgment, as you suggest and have laid out, that needs to be done to make good on that promissory note that she made at the beginning of the human condition.
I think that's right, John. And as I was trying to say before, that was where she saw her work going. I mean, through the later 1950s, she wrote a number of essays on this question. I mean, the Conquest of Space essay is specifically about this question, and it's one of those essays that's not so widely read as it should be, but it is in many ways a second reflection on this idea that's in the prologue and then at the end, at the last 20 pages of the human condition. And so that certainly continues it. So I would say this: after she publishes the human condition and then the Conquest of Space, she does two major projects. She writes On Revolution, which is not about the human condition in that sense, although it is about plurality. And then she writes the Eichmann in Jerusalem book, which is about the question of judgment. And then she begins working on, she writes a number of shorter essays that are often about the question of judgment, her stuff on truth and politics and lying in politics and others. And then she starts writing The Life of the Mind, which is specifically about judgment. Sadly, she died before she finished it, but I would suggest that is exactly the question she was struggling with as she came to the end of her life.
That's very helpful. That's very helpful.
So
that's
yeah, I
the
think
trajectory of her work.
Yeah,
and what she leaves us as a legacy to work on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were two main aspects of her work at this point. One is one is the intersection of politics and freedom, and that's what occupies her in essays like What is Authority and What is Freedom, and then the book On Revolution, and also the essay Civil Disobedience in this, in the 60s. And then the other is the question of judgment. And as you see in this essay on culture and politics, the question of judgment is intimately tied to the question of politics and freedom for her, insofar as politics is about judgment. And so you can't think about judgment. You can't think about politics without judgment. And in thinking about judgment, you can think about either culture or politics, but they both relate to the public. She doesn't write a big environmentalist essay. It's funny. I think that.
Yeah.
What?
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. But what I'm worried, I don't want us to make politics, either in her thought or in our thought, instrumental to environmental concerns.
No,
That
but I think
she has incipiently a view that is far bigger than that. It seems to me there can be a kind of ecological politics, plurality, judgment about the human condition, the earthly condition,
yeah,
which is fundamental to her thought, if I follow what you're saying.
I think so. I mean, what I'll say about that is politics is about thinking together and objectifying thinking about meaningful actions and speaking. And insofar as environmentalism has inserted itself into politics, it's become part of it. And so I think it's not instrumental, but it's now part of our political world. You couldn't think of our political world today without thinking about environmentalism. We're short on time, so I'm going to look at Johanna's question. In response to Bob's question, can we consider intent or intention in this creation of art and politics? Perhaps judgment is what allows discernment in these various manifestations of culture and politics. All that is held up as art is simply not that, but we need a language to help us distinguish what is and what is not good. So, the artist's intention, and I think Arendt is very traditional in this, is not so central, right? The artist exists in private, puts their work into the world, and in the best scenario, I think, for Arendt, the artist then retreats back into private, and lets the object, the thing, exist in the world. Judgment is what allows discernment. Yes, but the discernment and the judgment is by the spectators, not the artist. I think that's important for us to keep in mind. And so we have to always remember that for her, judgment is an activity of the spectator. The artists themselves has to make some sort of judgment, a cultural, a judgment about how to take their thought and put it in the world in a way that it will be noticed and seen. But that's not a political judgment, or I think a cultural judgment for her. Yes, the call for celebrities is certainly a lack of political judgment, as Jennifer writes. Daphne writes, my understanding is that politics today in the world of entertainment override politics today and the world of entertainment override. I'm not sure I understand this.
In the world of entertainment override.
Oh, entertainment override is that it is not the public world, but a carefully selected world that will accept opinions or manipulations as truth and then apply for numerical majority. Yeah. I mean, I think we're living in a world of what she would call mass society, in which there are opinions that are good opinions. I mean, and one way to understand the rise of someone like Trump and the alt-right is a rebellion of certain people against the homogeneity of what they consider to be mass society, or at least the mass cultural society that they saw as dominated largely by what they call liberal elites, us or me. Yeah, I might have to leave it at that. I should announce that our next session, I think, is scheduled for June 8th, but my understanding is that we may have to push it back for calendrical reasons to June 15th. We will let you know as soon as possible. And it's summer. Enjoy yourselves. take this big book out and read some Hannah Arendt. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a great beginning of your summer. Bye-bye.